Everyone in the neighborhood whispered about the new HOA fees, but no one dared speak aloud the way Mrs. Harper did. She stared at the notice in her hands, her knuckles white, the letters almost blurring together under the kitchen light. $4,000 a month. 4,000. It wasn't just a number, it was a wall. A barrier between her and the life she had built, the life she had fought for, the life she loved. Her neighbors passed by in their SUVs, waving politely, their smiles hiding the same fear she felt. The community had once been a sanctuary. Lush lawns, children riding bikes, evening barbecues. But now it was different. Tension lingered like fog over the streets. The HOA had grown, feeding on rules that seemed harmless at first, then twisted, one by one, into a chain that gripped the residents tighter and tighter. She remembered when she first moved in. The welcome committee, cheerful and bright, assuring her this was a place where families thrived, where everyone respected each other. And she had believed it. She had even smiled at the thought that she was lucky, that her little home, modest but full of warmth, was part of something bigger, something secure. Now, as she stared at that letter, she realized the cost of that security. Across the street, Mr. Thompson, a retired fireman, shuffled out of his garage with a rake. He paused, noticing her at the window. His face, lined and weathered, carried the same quiet despair she felt. They had all been blindsided. The fees were just the start. Late penalties, fines for unsanctioned plants in their gardens, mandatory inspections, rules that changed overnight like the tides, leaving them gasping. No one explained why. No one listened. The letters came like clockwork, relentless and impersonal, demanding obedience. Her daughter Emily peeked around the corner of the kitchen doorway. Her eyes were wide, but she tried to hide the tremor in her voice. "Mom, are we going to have to sell the house?" Mrs. Harper's throat tightened. She wanted to reach out to hold her daughter close, to shield her from the storm that was creeping over their lives. But the words wouldn't come. She didn't know the answer. The thought of losing everything they had worked for, the school projects, the birthday parties in the backyard, the late-night chats on the porch, was unbearable. Out of habit, she reread the notice. Each sentence seemed designed to punish, to humiliate. Failure to comply will result in fines. Your account is past due. Immediate action required. The HOA letters weren't just letters. They were weapons, silent, sharp, and unyielding. She closed her eyes, picturing the meeting from last month. Dozens of neighbors gathered in the community hall, their voices rising and falling in a tide of frustration and fear. Some shouted, some cried, and some just sat frozen as the board members stood at the front, their expressions carefully neutral. "This is standard procedure," one said, voice clipped and formal. "We are only enforcing the rules." But the rules had changed. Rules that seemed to exist only to squeeze them dry. To see how far they could push. Mrs. Harper opened her eyes and looked at the neighborhood outside. The sunset cast long shadows over the manicured lawns, shadows that seemed heavier than the homes themselves. Every fence, every hedge, every flower bed now felt like part of a game they hadn't agreed to play, a game they were already losing. Her phone buzzed, a message from the community group chat. Another house got a $2,500 fine for leaving their mailbox slightly crooked. HOA meeting tomorrow, everyone's invited. She swallowed hard. She didn't want to go, she wanted to hide. But something in her tightened, a spark of determination she thought the fees had crushed. She wasn't just a resident, she was a part of this community. And if they were going to fight them, someone had to start. As night fell, the street emptied. The SUVs, the evening joggers, the soft laughter from backyard dinners, everything disappeared, leaving only the quiet hum of the streetlights. Mrs. Harper sat at her kitchen table, staring at the notice again. She knew one thing: the HOA had underestimated her, and she was done being afraid. Somewhere deep inside, a thought formed, fragile but fierce. They may have the rules, but we have the people. And with that, the first flicker of a plan began to take shape, a plan that could change everything for her, her family, and the neighborhood she loved. But she didn't tell anyone yet, not a word, not until the time was right. Because in a town ruled by fear, the quietest voice sometimes carries the loudest truth. The next morning, the sun rose over the neighborhood, painting the streets gold, but it couldn't warm the chill that had settled over every home. Mrs. Harper stepped outside, coffee in hand, and noticed the subtle changes: an extra camera on a neighbor's porch, a freshly painted "No Trespassing" sign, and the ever-present feeling that they were all being watched. Across the street, Mr. Thompson was already outside, bending over his flower beds as if meticulous care could shield him from the mounting pressure. Their eyes met briefly, and he gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, but it carried weight. They were not alone in their unease. The community chat was buzzing with messages, some frantic, some defiant. $3,000 fine for a door color? One read. They are seriously out of control. Another, I can't pay this, my family will be homeless. Mrs. Harper's thumb hovered over her phone. She could respond, could vent, could join the chorus of fear, but instead she typed a single line, we need to meet, in person, no board members. It was a risk, they all knew it. The HOA had eyes everywhere. Rumors had spread about neighbors who spoke too freely, letters arriving within days, fines issued without warning, but fear had to be faced, otherwise it would consume them. By mid-afternoon, a small group had gathered in the local park, hidden behind tall oak trees. Parents with children, retirees with canes, young couples with worried expressions. Mrs. Harper stood in the center, her heart pounding. She looked at each of them, people she had waved to every morning, laughed with over potlucks, cheered at their kids' soccer games, and suddenly they were warriors. Unarmed, yes, but united in desperation. Thank you for coming, she began, voice trembling yet firm. We all know why we're here. These fees, these fines, they're not about rules, they're about control, about power, and they've been testing us, pushing us, seeing who will break first. Murmurs spread through the group, a mixture of agreement and fear, but Mrs. Harper pressed on. We can't wait for someone else to fix this. If we do nothing, they win. If we act carefully together, we have a chance. A young father holding his toddler raised his hand. But what can we do? They have lawyers, resources, we're just us. Mrs. Harper looked at him and felt the familiar pang of guilt and resolve. She remembered the nights her own family had stayed up worrying about money, about the bills, about whether the next letter would destroy their life. She drew in a deep breath. We may be just us, but there is strength in us. There's safety in numbers, and there's one thing they can't fine us for, the truth. The group was silent, the weight of her words settling over them like the first cold snap of winter. They all understood on some level that this was bigger than fines or rules. It was about dignity, about standing tall when the world tried to push them down. Mrs. Harper continued, laying out a plan. It was cautious at first, documenting every letter, every fine, every inspection. Sharing stories of neighbors already targeted so they could see the pattern, gathering evidence quietly. But as she spoke, her voice gained strength, the nervous tremor replaced by a quiet fire. Knowledge is our weapon, she said, and patience is our shield. We will not fight recklessly, but we will not be silent. A ripple went through the crowd. It wasn't a roar, not yet, but it was enough to make them believe that maybe, just maybe, they weren't powerless. As the meeting dispersed, a soft wind rustled the trees, carrying with it the faint laughter of children playing in the distance. Life continued outside, indifferent to the struggles within this hidden corner of the park. Mrs. Harper watched the families leave, nodding the determined set of their shoulders, the tight grip on hands, the quiet promise in their eyes. Alone for a moment, she checked her phone. Another message from the HOA, immediate action required, unpaid fees, non-compliance will be escalated. She didn't respond, not today, not yet. Instead, she sent a simple message to the group chat she had created. Step 1, observe. Step 2, protect. Step 3, fight smart, together. And as she put her phone away, a small smile touched her lips. She knew the road ahead would be treacherous. Letters would come, threats would come, fear would try to creep back in. But something had shifted in the neighborhood, something that the HOA could not anticipate. They were no longer just residents. They were witnesses. They were allies. They were ready to reclaim the community that had once been their sanctuary. And somewhere in the silent shadows of her home, Mrs. Harper whispered to herself, "Let them try. We are stronger than they think." The morning after their secret park meeting, the neighborhood felt different. But the change was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone not paying close attention. A breeze stirred the trees, children ran down the streets, and yet under the surface something had shifted. Eyes lingered longer on their neighbors, conversations carried a weight of understanding, and the fear that once clenched their hearts was tempered now by determination. Mrs. Harper stepped outside, glancing at the mailbox. Another notice had arrived. The envelope was thicker this time, stamped with official letters, and her pulse quickened before she even touched it. She knew what it contained, new fees, new threats, new rules designed to wear them down. She paused, staring at the street. Her neighbors moved about, seemingly unaware, but she sensed it. They were watching, listening, calculating. Every word, every step mattered now. She opened the letter carefully. The fines had increased, and there it was, hidden in legal jargon, a clause that could allow the HOA to seize property. $4,000 a month was no longer a financial burden, it was an existential threat. Her hands shook as she folded the letter and tucked it into her bag. She would not panic, not in front of her family, not in front of anyone. By mid-afternoon, the group reconvened. This time in the safety of Mrs. Harper's garage, transformed into a makeshift strategy room. Charts, letters, and photos of inspection reports were spread across the tables. Each neighbor brought a piece of the puzzle, a record, a story, a fear. It was a mosaic of injustice, and together they were beginning to see the pattern. "We're being targeted systematically," Mrs. Harper said, pointing to a sequence of letters lined up like dominoes. "Fines start small, then escalate. Rules change overnight. Inspectors appear unannounced. They're testing boundaries, seeing who folds first, but we won't be first, not us." A young woman clutching a notepad raised her hand. "How do we fight something so big? They have lawyers and cameras and rules stacked in their favor." Mrs. Harper's gaze softened, but it didn't lose its steel. "It's not about size, it's about truth. If we document, if we stand together, if we refuse to be intimidated, we can turn their rules against them. We can show their overreach, their abuse." The room was quiet. Fear lingered like a shadow, but behind it determination began to flicker. Each neighbor felt it, the realization that silence had allowed this to grow. Action, however small, could change the course. That evening, Mrs. Harper returned home to her daughter, Emily, who watched her with anxious eyes. "Mom, will they really take our house?" She knelt looking Emily in the eyes. "No, not if we do the right things. We're smart and we're careful and we're not alone." She hugged her tightly, but even as she held her daughter, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered, "They won't stop, and now that we're moving, they will fight harder." Sure enough, the next day, a white van parked in front of their home. A man in a dark suit, clipboard in hand, moved deliberately across the yard. He inspected the mailbox, measured the hedges, and left without a word, leaving only the faint hum of his engine behind. Mrs. Harper's heart raced. The first test, and she passed silently, keeping her composure while Emily clung to her side. Word spread quickly. The group met again, more urgently this time. Everyone had noticed the inspectors, the letters, the small acts of intimidation. But instead of retreating, their conversations became sharper, faster. They planned contingencies, assigned tasks. One neighbor would log every inspection, another would photograph every notice, another would contact legal advisors discreetly. And through it all, Mrs. Harper felt the weight of responsibility. She had started this movement almost on a whim, a spark of defiance in a sea of fear. But now it was real. People were counting on her, not just for leadership, but for courage. And she realized something vital. Courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was moving forward despite it. Late that night, she sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by the quiet of her home. The city slept, but the battle had already begun. She looked at the stack of HOA notices and felt a strange mix of anger and resolve. They were powerful, yes, but only in isolation. Together, the neighborhood could withstand anything. Her phone buzzed. A new message from the HOA. Immediate compliance required. Failure to comply will result in legal action. Mrs. Harper stared at it for a long moment, then typed a simple response to her group chat. "Document everything. Observe quietly. Prepare for escalation. This is our moment. Stay strong." She set the phone down, staring out the window at the sleeping streets. Somewhere out there, the inspectors were plotting their next move. Somewhere out there, the HOA believed they had control. But control, she knew, was an illusion. And the first cracks in their armor were forming, not in the rules, not in the letters, but in the hearts of the people they thought they could dominate. And Mrs. Harper, tired yet unyielding, whispered to herself, "Let them come, we're ready." The next morning, the street felt different. Not the golden light of dawn, not the laughter of children, but a tension that pressed against the windows, the hedges, the very air. Mrs. Harper stepped outside, coffee in hand, and noticed the subtle signs. A freshly printed notice tacked to a lamppost across the street, a new surveillance camera pointing directly at her yard, and neighbors moving more cautiously, as if each step might trigger some invisible punishment. By mid-morning, the HOA's retaliation became undeniable. Notices arrived in thick envelopes, stamped with urgent warnings and penalties. They weren't just fines anymore, they were threats dressed in legalese. Failure to comply would result in legal escalation or property seizure. The words hit harder than any letter had before, their weight sinking into the chest like cold iron. Mrs. Harper felt her stomach twist. The fear was back, clawing at the edges of her resolve. But she refused to show it, not in front of Emily, not in front of the neighbors who had begun to rely on her quiet strength. She gathered the group again, this time in her backyard. Tables were set with documents, letters, and laptops, a war room disguised as a casual meeting. Faces were drawn, tired, and lined with worry, but there was fire there too, the same fire that had sparked in the park weeks ago. "We expected resistance," Mrs. Harper said, her voice calm, deliberate. "But this is escalation. They want to scare us into submission. They want us to act out of fear, to make mistakes. We won't give them that satisfaction." One of the neighbors, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, shook his head. "They're coming at us with everything. Cameras, letters, fines, inspections. How do we even fight this? It's relentless." Mrs. Harper leaned forward, eyes fierce. "We fight smart. Observe, document, and respond only when necessary. Their strength is intimidation, our strength is unity, and our truth is unassailable." A young couple, their hands entwined tightly, nodded. "We've been recording everything. Photos, videos, dates. We can show a pattern. We can prove it's systematic." "Yes," Mrs. Harper said, her voice firm. "Evidence is our shield, and patience is our sword. They may think they control the narrative, but we control the facts. Every violation, every arbitrary rule change, every aggressive action, they can't erase the truth, and truth has a power they will never understand." As they strategized, Emily sat nearby, coloring quietly but listening. She looked up at her mother and whispered, "Mom, will they really stop?" Mrs. Harper's heart clenched. She wanted to protect her daughter from the ugly reality of the fight, but she also knew this was a lesson in courage. Kneeling beside her, she took Emily's small hand in hers. "We don't know if they'll stop, but we know we'll stand together. That's what matters. That's what makes us stronger than them." Later that afternoon, the HOA sent inspectors again. They arrived without warning, measuring, photographing, and scrutinizing every detail of the homes along the street. Some residents froze, others fumed silently. But Mrs. Harper remained composed. She documented every action, every word, every movement. No slip-ups, no reactions, only evidence. By evening, the group reconvened to review what they had gathered. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating, but also electric. Each new piece of evidence strengthened their resolve. They could see the pattern now, the strategy behind the intimidation, and most importantly, they realized something vital. They were not powerless. The moral of their struggle was becoming clear, not just to Mrs. Harper, but to every neighbor present. Fear could be manipulated, rules could be weaponized, but courage and unity were harder to break than any legal document. And sometimes, the quietest resistance carried the loudest truth. As night fell, Mrs. Harper returned home, exhausted but determined. Emily was asleep, the house silent except for the faint hum of streetlights outside. She looked at the pile of notices, the growing mountain of evidence, and whispered to herself, "We've started something they cannot control, and they will learn that power isn't in fear, it's in the people who refuse to bow to it." Outside, the wind rustled the trees, carrying the distant sounds of a neighborhood that was no longer just a collection of homes. It was a community awakening, and the battle had only just begun. The following morning, the streets were quieter than usual. Not a sign of surrender, but a strange, tense calm. Mrs. Harper walked outside and noticed the subtle changes. The neighbors' gazes lingering longer, children being shepherded indoors, doors carefully closed. Everyone was aware. The HOA was watching, waiting, calculating their next move. By mid-morning, the retaliation became personal. Letters targeted individual families, not just generic fines. Property violation, unauthorized modifications, immediate compliance required, but each one carried a tone sharper than before, a direct message meant to intimidate. Mrs. Harper opened hers carefully. One line stood out. "Your actions have not gone unnoticed. Further defiance will be met with legal action." Her hands trembled slightly, but she didn't show it. Emily peeked around the kitchen doorway, her small voice wavering. "Mom, are we in trouble?" Mrs. Harper knelt beside her daughter, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "We're in a fight, Emily, but not a fight we can lose. We just have to be smart, careful, and brave." She gathered the group again, this time in the safety of Mr. Thompson's garage. Maps of the neighborhood, stacks of letters, photos, and videos were spread across the tables. It was no longer just strategy, it was evidence. A record of harassment and intimidation, of rules weaponized against the residents. "We can't let them isolate anyone," Mrs. Harper said firmly. "They're trying to make us feel alone, scared, powerless. But together, we're stronger than their letters, stronger than their inspectors, stronger than their threats." A middle-aged woman spoke, voice tight with worry. They fined my husband $1,500 just for planting flowers outside the lines they set. He's devastated. I don't know how much more we can take." Mrs. Harper met her eyes, her voice soft but resolute. "I know it's hard. Every fine, every letter, every threat feels like it's crushing us, but fear is their weapon, courage is ours, and we won't break, not now, not ever." By late afternoon, the HOA escalated further. Inspectors appeared at multiple homes simultaneously, cameras recording, clipboards scribbling, pens checking boxes. One neighbor, trying to defend herself, was met with a cold stare and the suggestion of a formal complaint against her. It was a warning not just to her but to everyone watching. Compliance was mandatory. Resistance would be punished. But the residents did not back down. Mrs. Harper had prepared them. Every interaction was documented, every letter photographed, every inspection recorded. They moved carefully, silently building the case that would expose the HOA's overreach. Even Emily, young and innocent, noticed the tension. She tugged at her mother's sleeve one evening. "Mom, why are they so mean?" Mrs. Harper paused, holding her daughter's small hands. "Sometimes people want control more than they want kindness, but that doesn't mean we give up. It just means we have to fight smarter." That night, Mrs. Harper reviewed the growing mountain of evidence. Photos of inspectors standing on neighbors' lawns, letters stacked by date and severity, screenshots of group chat messages. Each piece told a story of intimidation, of fear, of resilience. And through it all, she realized something powerful. This wasn't just about the fees. It was about dignity, about refusing to be silenced, about standing up for what was right, even when it seemed impossible. She sent a message to the group chat. "Tomorrow we take the next step. We present our case together. No one is alone. We are ready." As she set down her phone, a small smile touched her lips. The road ahead would be dangerous. The HOA would fight back harder, push further, try to break their resolve. But for the first time, Mrs. Harper felt the tide turning. They were no longer just victims. They were witnesses, recorders, defenders of their homes, their families, their community. Outside, the wind whispered through the streets, carrying the faint hum of life continuing, indifferent to the battles within each home. But inside, a quiet revolution had begun. And the residents, once fearful and hesitant, now understood a truth the HOA would soon learn. Unity and courage could never be fined. And Mrs. Harper, exhausted but unyielding, whispered to herself, "They will not win, not over us, not while we stand together." The neighborhood woke under a gray sky, the kind that presses down and makes every worry feel heavier. Mrs. Harper stepped outside, noticing the subtle but unnerving signs. A drone hovering silently over Mr. Thompson's backyard, a new security patrol slowly cruising the streets, and neighbors peeking nervously through curtains. The HOA had stepped up their surveillance, and everyone could feel it. By mid-morning, the tension escalated further. Notices arrived that weren't just letters anymore. They were formal demands, stamped with urgent warnings and legal threats. Some neighbors had fines doubled overnight. Others received notices that required immediate action on matters they didn't even know were rules. The community was on edge, each envelope a reminder of the power the HOA wielded, and the isolation they wanted everyone to feel. Mrs. Harper gathered the group in her living room. This meeting wasn't casual. It wasn't optional. Every neighbor brought new evidence. Videos of inspectors measuring sidewalks, photos of surveillance cameras, screenshots of letters that had arrived at odd hours. The room hummed with tension, but also with purpose. "We've been patient," Mrs. Harper began, her voice low but commanding. "We've documented, observed, and strategized, but now it's time to take the next step. We have the proof we need, and we have each other. That is what scares them more than anything." A man at the table shook his head. "But they've already tried to intimidate us. They're watching. How do we present this without putting ourselves in more danger?" Mrs. Harper leaned forward, her eyes burning with quiet intensity. "Carefully, smartly, we reveal the truth, but not recklessly. Every letter, every photo, every video tells a story, and that story is about abuse of power. We don't need to fight with anger. We fight with facts, with courage, and with unity." A young woman at the edge of the group spoke softly. "What if they retaliate even harder? What if we can't handle it?" Mrs. Harper took a deep breath, her mind flashing to Emily, to the neighbors who had begun to trust her guidance, to the countless nights she had lain awake imagining what could happen. "Fear is natural," she said. "It will always be there, but courage isn't the absence of fear, it's action in spite of it. And right now our action is necessary, for us, for our families, for this community. By afternoon, preparations were in full swing. Each resident had a role, someone to monitor letters and notices, someone to record inspections, someone to liaise discreetly with legal advisors. Mrs. Harper herself coordinated the flow, ensuring that every detail was documented and every step planned. The air was thick with anticipation, the unspoken question hanging over them all: would this be enough? Late in the day, a van rolled slowly down the street, inspectors inside. Cameras on the dashboard scanned the homes. Neighbors held their breath, some hiding behind curtains, some standing tall in their yards. But Mrs. Harper remained calm. She documented every movement, every glance, every action. No reaction, only evidence. As dusk settled, the group reconvened to review the day's findings. The stack of photos, letters, and videos had grown, a mountain of undeniable proof. Each piece reinforced what they already suspected. The HOA's actions were systematic, targeted, and relentless. But instead of breaking their spirit, it strengthened it. Mrs. Harper looked around the room at the tired but determined faces. "We are ready," she said, her voice firm. "Tomorrow we begin the next phase, we present our case, we show the truth, and we do it together. No one is alone." That night she sat quietly in her kitchen, staring out the window at the darkened street. The neighborhood was calm, but she knew the storm was coming. The HOA would not back down. They would escalate. They would try to intimidate harder to break the unity that was forming here. But Mrs. Harper felt something deeper now. She felt the strength of the community, the quiet courage of neighbors who had once been afraid, now standing side by side. She felt the hope in Emily's eyes, the resilience in Mr. Thompson's stance, and the unspoken promise that they would protect each other. She whispered to herself, a vow more than a thought. "They can try to push us, scare us, fine us, but they will never control the heart of this neighborhood. Not while we stand together." And somewhere in the shadows of the street, the first cracks in the HOA's armor began to appear. Not in the rules, not in the letters, but in the courage of the people who refused to bow. The sun barely peeked over the rooftops that morning, casting a pale light on the neighborhood, but it couldn't illuminate the tension that had settled over every home. Mrs. Harper stepped onto her porch and noticed it immediately. The neighbors were awake earlier than usual, moving cautiously but with purpose. There was a quiet electricity in the air, the kind that happens just before a storm. The HOA had escalated. Overnight, more letters had arrived, thicker envelopes, legalese that hinted at court proceedings. Some neighbors had fines tripled, others were threatened with liens on their property. It was no longer about rules, it was a battle of wills, a game of control, and the HOA believed they were winning. But Mrs. Harper and the group were ready. Months of careful documentation, quiet meetings, and coordinated observations had built something they couldn't take away, proof. And tonight, they planned to act. By mid-afternoon, the group convened in a neighbor's garage, transformed into a command center. Letters were stacked by date, videos labeled by inspection, photos meticulously organized. Each piece of evidence told a story of intimidation, arbitrary fines, and overreach. "We show them we're not afraid," Mrs. Harper said, her voice low but firm. "But we do it smartly. This is bigger than us, bigger than anger. This is about fairness, about dignity, about the right to live without fear in your own home." One of the younger neighbors, holding her tablet, spoke up. "Do you think they'll retaliate? I mean, after we present everything." Mrs. Harper's gaze hardened. "They will, and we're ready for it, but that doesn't mean we stop. The truth is stronger than intimidation. And when the community stands together, no letter, no fine, no threat can break us." As the evening approached, they prepared their presentation, a meticulous account of every action the HOA had taken against the neighborhood. They rehearsed how they would present it to the local authorities, the media, and anyone else who could help hold the HOA accountable. Each neighbor had a role, a voice, a story to tell. Meanwhile, the neighborhood itself felt the tension. Drones hovered in the distance, security patrols moved slowly down the streets, and cameras seemed to appear on every corner. But the residents were no longer passive. They documented everything with quiet precision. Every glance, every movement, every attempt at intimidation was recorded. Later that night, Mrs. Harper sat at her kitchen table, reviewing the evidence one last time. She glanced at Emily, sleeping soundly in the next room, and felt the weight of responsibility. This was no longer just a fight for fines or rules. It was a fight for safety, for dignity, for the right to live without fear. A message pinged on her phone, a neighbor confirming the final arrangements for the presentation. Mrs. Harper typed back a single line, "Stay calm, be strong, we are ready." The night stretched long, but sleep was impossible. She stared out the window, watching shadows dance across the street, knowing the HOA would escalate once they realized what was coming. And yet she felt a strange calm. They were prepared, they were united, and they had something far more powerful than fear, the truth. The next morning, they walked into the meeting room with quiet determination. The HOA representatives sat smugly at the front, confident that intimidation and legalese would silence any opposition. But as Mrs. Harper began to speak, recounting the months of harassment, fines, and arbitrary rules, the room began to shift. Neighbors presented evidence, letters, photos, videos, each item a silent indictment of the HOA's tactics. The fear that had hung over the neighborhood for so long evaporated, replaced by the raw power of truth and unity. Even the board members' expressions shifted, uncertainty creeping into their carefully maintained composure. Mrs. Harper concluded, voice steady, eyes meeting each of the neighbors. "We are not just residents. We are a community, and we will not be silenced. We will not be intimidated. This is our home, our families, our lives, and we will stand together." For the first time in months, a quiet sense of victory settled over the group. It wasn't over yet. The HOA could still retaliate, but something fundamental had changed. The power they thought they held over the neighborhood had shifted. The residents were no longer afraid. They were resolute. As they left the room, Emily clinging to her mother's hand, Mrs. Harper felt a wave of relief, but also a surge of pride. They had faced fear, intimidation, and relentless pressure, and they had not broken. Outside, the street was quiet, almost serene. But beneath that calm, the neighborhood was alive, awake, and united. The HOA had underestimated them, and Mrs. Harper knew with absolute certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. She whispered to herself, eyes scanning the quiet homes around her. "We have fought, we have stood, and together we are unstoppable." The morning sun spilled over the neighborhood, warm and golden, but this time it felt different. It didn't just illuminate the streets. It reflected the quiet resilience of the people who lived there. Mrs. Harper stepped onto her porch, coffee in hand, and breathed deeply. The tension that had weighed on every home for months had not vanished completely, but it had shifted. It was lighter now, tempered by courage and unity. The HOA letters still arrived. Inspectors still made appearances, but the residents moved with calm determination instead of fear. Each letter, each inspection, each fine had been meticulously documented, presented to authorities, and shared with legal advisors. The tide had turned. The community no longer felt like subjects under scrutiny. They were citizens demanding fairness. Mrs. Harper gathered the neighbors in the park one last time, the place where it had all quietly begun. Families, couples, retirees, and children formed a loose circle, their faces lined with exhaustion but glowing with quiet triumph. The struggle had been long and intimidating, but they had endured. "We started this months ago with fear in our hearts and hope in our minds," Mrs. Harper began, her voice steady but emotional. "We were pushed, tested, and intimidated. The HOA tried to break us with rules, fines, and threats, but look around you, we didn't break. We stood together, and that's what matters." A murmur of agreement spread through the group. Some smiled, some wiped away tears, and some just stood silently proud. They all knew the truth. The real victory wasn't just legal. It wasn't in fines overturned or letters rescinded. The victory was in dignity regained, courage discovered, and a community reborn. One of the neighbors, an elderly man who had spent years quietly paying fines, stepped forward. "I didn't think I'd have the courage," he admitted, voice trembling. "But seeing everyone come together, I feel like we've taken back our neighborhood." Mrs. Harper nodded, feeling the weight of every sleepless night, every anxious morning, every quiet plan come together. "Fear can be powerful," she said softly. "But unity is stronger, and courage, real courage, is contagious. It spreads quietly until suddenly it cannot be ignored." Children played in the grass nearby, their laughter a testament to life continuing despite the struggles. Parents watched them, relaxed for the first time in months. The neighborhood, once tense and divided by fear, had become vibrant again, safe again, alive. As the meeting dispersed, Mrs. Harper lingered, looking down the streets that had been both battleground and home. She thought of Emily, safe inside with her father, and felt a profound sense of relief mixed with pride. They had faced the storm together and had emerged stronger. That evening she wrote in her journal, Sometimes the strongest battles are invisible. They're fought not with weapons, but with courage, not with anger, but with unity, not with loud voices, but with quiet resilience. We have learned that fear is temporary, but dignity lasts forever. The wind rustled the trees gently, carrying the faint hum of life in motion. And for the first time in months, Mrs. Harper didn't flinch at every shadow, every letter, every knock at the door. The neighborhood had been tested, and it had passed. They had reclaimed more than their homes. They had reclaimed their hearts, their community, and their spirit. Walking back into her home, she paused to glance at Emily's drawings taped to the fridge, a reminder of innocence, hope, and the life they had fought to protect. She whispered softly, more to herself than anyone else, "We stood, we fought, and together we prevailed." Outside, the streetlights flickered on as dusk settled, casting long shadows over manicured lawns that now felt alive with possibility. The HOA's power had been challenged, yes, but more importantly, the residents' courage had been proven, and that courage, once awakened, could never be silenced. In the quiet of the evening, Mrs. Harper closed the door, exhaled slowly, and smiled. The neighborhood was no longer just a collection of homes. It was a living testament to resilience, unity, and the unstoppable force of ordinary people refusing to be intimidated. And as night fell, one truth lingered in the air, gentle but powerful. Fear may try to rule, but the heart of a united community can never be controlled. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one, the truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.